So for first-time parents, I would recommend orienting them to the process and sharing information about the IEP in advance of the IEP so that they don't come to the IEP to learn about the IEP. You do some tutoring in advance so that they know what to expect. And I've seen different schools do that in different ways. And it's usually just a matter of the case manager, the resource teacher, meeting with the family and explaining what's going to happen. Maybe showing an example of an IEP while protecting confidentiality so that the family knows kind of what they're in for and what to expect. In Metro Vancouver, we have a very diverse population. Not everyone speaks English as a first language. So consider if you need an interpreter. We could actually add interpreter to the list of characters who attend the IEP meeting. I've been to some IEP meetings where the family has English as a second language. And they may say to us, I'm okay, I think I can get by without an interpreter. And at the end of the meeting, you can tell that, no, that wasn't very effective for them. They didn't really understand everything. And they might tell you that. I've been in some meetings where the school makes that assumption that, mom or dad's English is really good. I don't think we need an interpreter. But then at the end of the meeting, you can tell that they didn't really follow everything, and that's not very fair. So having an interpreter, I've been to a number of meetings that have had professional interpreters or non-professional interpreters, and it absolutely makes a difference. It does take some coordination. In some cases, it takes a bit of funding to hire an interpreter to come in. I've had some schools that have gotten creative around this. I was at a school a couple of years ago where mom was at the IEP meeting. Mom spoke Mandarin as her first language, didn't have a strong command of English. And mom actually suggested she had a friend's daughter in grade 11 at that school, and she got consent from her friend for the daughter to come to the IEP meeting. So we're all sitting there in the IEP meeting, and there's this grade 11 student who came in and she'd been prepped about what was going to happen and about confidentiality, and she functioned as the interpreter throughout that meeting. That was very creative. That was in the moment problem solving, but it helped the meeting go better. So take a minute and just make sure, this is about clear communication, right? Everyone needs to understand what's going on at the IEP meeting. If you need an interpreter, arrange for it to happen. Oh, I put it here again, just so I keep hammering this one. The SEA must be present. Why? Because I've already told you why. Because they know the student best, and it's disrespectful not to include them. Hard copy for each person. I've already mentioned that. Allow adequate time when scheduling. So there's two big issues about time for IEP meetings. And I recognize that time is our enemy, it seems. We don't have enough time for scheduling IEP meetings. The first is, when you set the IEP meeting, setting enough time. So this is the school issue, right? This isn't the parent issue. The parent should advocate for adequate time. Often 1 hour isn't adequate time, but there are times where it can totally be adequate time. So you can't just go by, well, we always do 1 hour IEP meetings. Sometimes that's effective and sometimes that's ineffective. An IEP is designed to be effective, so you need effective amounts of time allocated to them. So I would argue that this is a bit of a moving target, where early on, at the beginning of the school career, you might have longer IEP meetings because you're orienting the family. There may be more cast of characters involved. The more people there, as I mentioned earlier, you should have more time. And then later on, or for IEP check-ins throughout the year or at the end of the year, you can get away with less time. At the end of, or before transitions, because I want to make sure that I'm mindful of middle schools, before you leave elementary school to go to middle school, that year, the IEP meeting should be a little bit longer because you need to be thinking about transitions and have opportunities to talk about transitions. And then at the receiving school, they'll be a little bit longer because you're receiving a student, and now there's background that needs to be, and history that needs to be discussed. And then when you come into high school, similarly, there may be earlier meetings at the beginning of high school. And because I've done a fair bit of work in high schools over the last number of years, one of the things that I've really appreciated, and this was just by being exposed to it, is for the, towards the end of grade 11 and certainly into grade 12, you're preparing for the greatest transition, for the transition out of the educational system that the child's been in for the last 12 or 13 years to the rest of their life. And what's been particularly effective are some schools that I've worked with where they've decided that it is worthwhile to have dedicated 2-hour blocks for graduating students because there's so much to talk about. There's transitioning from Ministry of Education to community living. Different ministries are involved and different paperwork. And the school is also educating the family about what's to come. And it's been really rewarding to be in those meetings that are given the luxury or the gift of time. And the biggest proponents of that are the parents themselves, who at the end of the meetings have said to us, this was wonderful. These are some of the best IEP meetings we've ever had because we weren't rushed out. We got to everything. We got to ask all of our questions. This is a really stressful time, just like coming in was all those years ago, because now we're about to leave this system. And this is the last time we're going to have access to all these wonderful people and all this knowledge and support. This will be absent when we leave the school system. So I appreciate that in the real, if I'm a principal watching this, I'm going, we don't have time for 2-hour IEP meetings. I get that there are practical implications, but I'm simply advocating for flexibility and trying to be adaptable. Sometimes we can get away with less time, and sometimes we actually do need to find and overcome systems barriers to allow adequate time for the meetings themselves. So that's about scheduling time. And I know there's lots of teachers out there going, amen, right, we need this. Blame my principal, the principal doesn't give me time. The principal's saying, don't blame me, it's reality. I get the lay of the land. I do a lot of work in schools. I fully appreciate the realities. But they're not insurmountable. They just require some creativity. Now, the last point here is that inside the meeting, whether it's an hour or 90 minutes or 2 hours, you need to manage the time effectively. That means, in most cases, the primary objective in an IEP meeting is to talk about the short-term objectives. What are we actually teaching this year? What are our objectives? And the worst case you could be in, the worst scenario is you leave the meeting and you didn't get to talk about all of those things. Now, in many cases, there is a structure and a format template for the IEP that starts with, well, let's revisit what are the current students, what are the students' current strengths? What are their current stretches? Let's check in on their medications. Let's check on about how they learn best and their preferences. And we spend all this time going through these things, which is important, but arguably could be gained at other times outside of the meeting. And when we allocate all of our meeting time to these things, we don't get to the meat of the meeting, which is the short-term objectives. So when I am asked to go in and do IEP coaching and training, I really stress this, that your eye should be the author of the IEP, the case manager, who's the host of the meeting, also needs to be an expert timekeeper and make sure that they are kind of triaging things and allocating sufficient time for the most important things. I was at an IEP recently where it was the second IEP of the day. We actually did get through the first IEP in 1 hour, but then we were meeting for the second student's IEP. And the teacher said, all right, we've got the EA here, but the EA has to leave halfway through. And we've got one of the other specialists here, but the specialist has to leave about halfway through. And so I suggested, you know what, given the fact that we've got all of the important players here right now, can we just flip the agenda? Can we start at the bottom and just talk about the short-term objectives while everybody is here? And then when those important people have to leave, then we will have time to talk about the other things that are probably a little less important. And that will be a better use of time. And everyone was okay with that and flexible, and that worked out very well. We got to the end of our meeting and we didn't kind of feel gypped that we hadn't got to certain things. So there's a lot to be considered around time management. Some other advice to parents, because this is your child's meeting, that's why we're here. Bring a picture of your child. I've been to some wonderful IEP meetings where the parents brought in the most recent school picture, a great big portrait, and they put it at the front of the table. And it was just this constant reminder that, you know, Johnny's right there. We can see Johnny's cute smiling face. This is why we're here. Certainly helps head off any potential conflict where people might have competing ideas when you think, okay, I'm willing to compromise or, give in and, we're going to work this out in a collaborative fashion because it's not about me, it's not about you. The reminder's right there. Look at that smiling face. So it's just a small qualitative change that I've been in meetings that have done this, and I can tell you it does make a difference. Not that you have to bring a picture to every IEP. It doesn't hurt to bring a treat to some of the IEPs. Not everyone's able to bring a treat. You don't have to bring a treat. It's everyone's job to be there. But I can think of one family in particular where mom made this bread bowl. You rip the top off and there's a dip inside of it. And she was really good at making this, and she brought it to the kindergarten meeting, and everyone absolutely loved it. And so she brought it to the grade 1 IEP meeting and then the grade 2 IEP meeting. And what started to happen was every teacher in that building wanted her kid to come into their class in the next grade because they wanted to go to his IEP meetings. The word spread how good this particular treat was. Right? So it's not really bribing teachers to want your child, but it did create a really hospitable atmosphere, and people could joke about it. Right? So it's adding a bit of levity and fun to these. Give some thoughts. So this is about prepping the families in advance, explicitly teaching them, coaching them, give some thought to what you want so that when you come into the meeting, and it might be intimidating, there's a lot of people here and you might feel intimidated, not want to talk. It's hard to formulate your ideas under those circumstances. Come in with a bit of a prepared agenda. You want to share all these important things about your child. Some schools I work with do a particularly good job of this. They've really built this into how they do business. Here's an example, preparing for an IEP meeting. If the individual education plan is to meet the student's needs, it must be based on a solid understanding of the whole student. Parental input in this process is important. As you know your child well, that's an understatement. You know your child well. You know your child best. It's only through a collaborative approach that we'll be able to develop an individual education plan that takes into account your child's individual personality traits, learning style, strengths, and difficulties. As you prepare for our meeting, you may want to consider some of the following. What do you think is important for us to know about your child? What is your long-term vision for your child? What kinds of supports would you like the school to provide to your child? What works best at home when communicating with your child? That's getting to that communication domain. What positive feedback do you give at home that motivates your child? That's getting to effective consequences. How do you feel your child learns best? Tell us what your child's strengths and talents are. What do you feel are your child's greatest challenges or stretches? What makes your child upset or afraid? And what strategies have you found useful in supporting your child in times of upset or anxiety? All of this can be helpful. I would share this with this family and say, pick and choose which things you want to answer. You don't have to answer all of this. This isn't an assignment where you have to come up with things. This is really a genuine expression of your priorities. And so here's just some guiding principles of what you can share. And that comes along with this little table. Right? Provide some background and history. What do you want us to know about your child that will allow us to serve him or her best? Learning style and personality, special abilities and strengths. I have a student I worked with for years. We discovered one of her special abilities and strengths recently. She's now in high school, clearly impacted by her autism, doesn't say a whole lot, but we put a blank calendar. It was like July 2018 in front of her. And this was like a year later, and she took the calendar and she started writing in the calendar. She wrote camp, 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 camp. She wrote on the weekends particular movies. And we looked at this and we were shocked that she put this information in. And we thought, oh, this is probably her wishful thinking. This looks like her ideal, July calendar. But then we got suspicious, and so we asked Mom, and Mom went back and looked in her agenda, and everything that our student wrote a year later was exactly correct. She had memorized everything she did in July a year ago. And then now that we were totally intrigued by this and we pushed a little bit more, we asked her, oh, you went to this camp on that day. Who'd you go with? And she wrote the name of the support person who drove her. Oh, you went to this movie. Who did you go with? She wrote Dad. And we checked. Yeah, Dad took her to that movie a year ago, July 18th, Saturday. It was remarkable. We were blown away. So that's a cool special ability and strength, right? That's something that we can build social opportunities around. Her friends think that that's really cool. That helps them see her in a different light. They see more of her abilities and less of her challenges when she can demonstrate really cool things like that. That's special ability. Interests, difficulties, anything else. Again, this isn't meant to be prescriptive. This is what do you want us to know? What do you think would be valuable? If you were in our shoes, what would you want to know about your student? Then preparing for and running the IEP meeting, the case manager will manage everything, make sure that formal introductions are provided, and I've already kind of addressed that. Any explanations for everyone in attendance about how this is going to go, who all these scary people are. There's often recommendations to the parents that in addition to the information I just shared, that you could create an About Me brochure for your child. I've seen a few families who have done this, just a little bit of magic on a word processor. It's a brochure with some cute pictures of the student that shows some of their strengths and weaknesses and preferences and communication profiles. And it's a very easy to digest, quick bit of information. I always make sure to stress that it's a brochure, it's not a booklet, because people have time for brochures. People don't tend to really read past the second page of a multi-page document. So it's a quick bit of information sharing. I've also worked with a number of students who have transitioned into high schools. One of the challenges with high school is that now you're merging a lot of kids who didn't go to the same elementary schools. You're in a bigger pond. And for some of the students I've worked with, everyone in their little pond in elementary school knew them, knew that they had autism, knew that there were some learning differences. If there were some peculiar mannerisms or things like that, understood that, didn't tease them or bully them. But now when that student comes into high school, in this bigger pond, not everyone understands, not everyone's going to be so compassionate and considerate. There's an increased risk of bullying. And I found that it's been very effective for either the student to create a PowerPoint themselves that's about me, right? I'm Richard, I have autism, here's are the things that I'm good at, here are the things that I need help with. Or in some cases, we have the parent or maybe an EA help create that, or I've had an EA kind of put it together and then coach the student to narrate it. And then we get consent from the parents, of course, to share that either with one of the, if it's a grade 8 is the first year of high school, if that's the circumstance, one grade 8 class, or we have an assembly with the entire grade 8 population. And just the feedback from doing things like that are that everyone could see the students who knew that there was something different about their peer, but didn't know what it was and weren't very sensitive and may have been a little bit bullying or not tolerant of that. Once they saw this About Me PowerPoint, it just changed everything. They were much more compassionate, they were much more supportive of their peer, and it had a very positive knock-on effect. So that's just something to think about that, of course, would occur outside of the IEP meeting. The other thing that parent might want to do if they've invited their private professionals in is just make it very clear why their invited private professionals are there. If the school is a speech pathologist and the family brings in their speech pathologist, the family can communicate why they want their speech pathologist there. That just makes things very clear and transparent. And in some cases, a school might feel a little bit defensive, like, well, we have that, why would you bring that in? It might feel like a bit of an attack. Or certainly there have been circumstances where a family has asked me to go into school and the school becomes a little defensive, like, doesn't the parent trust us? Why do they want you here? Are you here to evaluate us and report on us? Absolutely not. It needs to be very clear just so that we can have collaborative, positive working environments. So moving on, characteristics of an effective IEP meeting, positive vibe, often kind of an informal, casual vibe, keeping in mind who we're all there for. Again, third or fourth time, the education assistant needs to be there. And time management, time management, time management. In order to achieve the objectives of the meeting, you need to have effective time management. That's a skill that really deserves to be explicitly taught around managing meetings to get through important information. Now, the last thing I'm going to share here, and then we will actually be ending a little bit early. Oh, congratulations. Writing practices. We've talked about the content that's going to go into the IEPs, the broad categories that we need to be thinking about. Tomorrow, we're going to get into the details of populating that information. The school districts or the school board gets to determine the format for the IEP. So usually school districts will have invested in some software. This is how they do their IEPs. I think it's important for everyone to recognize and simply respect this is the template that you're going to be working within. I've certainly been in circumstances where there are some concerns raised, maybe some shortcomings of the software that had to be used, and schools were flexible and said, you know what, we have to use the software, but we'll keep 2 versions of the IEP on file. We'll do one version in the software that we have to use, and then we'll have another format of it that is more palatable or understandable to the parent, and that will be like an addendum to our IEP. I've certainly seen that happen. It doesn't have to happen. The simplest thing is just to recognize, okay, we're going to work within the template that the school district has. And one of the reasons I say that is I'm sharing some ideas with you and some recommendations and rules of thumb that you might take forward into a school district where it doesn't exactly fit. And I'm not saying try to force it to fit. Work within the systems that exist. Now, I mentioned earlier that there have been some litigation, some lawsuits around IEPs. The most famous one in British Columbia is known as the Huco ruling, and this is about meaningful consultation. And the short version of this is that a family of a student with autism, I believe this was out into the Fraser Valley, was concerned that the school wasn't engaging in meaningful consultation with their private specialists who they wanted to have come in. And so there was legal action taken. And the punchline of the Huco case is that the ruling is schools do have an obligation to engage in meaningful consultation. Right? So they are obligated to have a meeting, engage in consultation. But I also want to be very careful and very respectful of the legalities involved, because there's also the School Act. And the School Act is the laws that govern the Ministry of Education and the educational establishment. And I was fortunate many years ago when I worked for the preschool autism program in Manitoba, that we had a lawyer come in and teach us, all of the consultants and speech pathologists and occupational therapists, as we were starting to do some work in the schools, about the School Act. And even though that was in another province, the big ideas generalize across provinces. The big idea that I remember from that training about the School Act is that schools are autonomous and they have essentially 99% authority to do what they're going to do, which means a parent can't necessarily go in, even though they are the parent, and dictate how things will be. The School Act actually gives the authority to the school. So it's important for parents to understand their rights within the School Act. I think it would be great if there was actually broader education available to parents and professionals and school staff about the School Act. I'd certainly sign up to go to that workshop to learn about the legalities involved. One of the things that I take away as a behavior analyst who's often invited to go in at the family's request, that the family sends me in and the school receives me as a guest and a visitor, is making sure that I'm very much aware of my role, that I can go in and if the school is engaging in meaningful consultation with me, seeking and asking my opinion, and I give recommendations, the School Act does not obligate the school to accept any of my recommendations, right? Meaningful consultation does not mean that there will be 100% adopting of the result of that consultation, of the recommendations. So that's an important difference, I think, to be very clear of. Now, most schools that I go into, vast majority of cases, if they are engaging in consultation and I offer recommendations, they're quite happy to incorporate those recommendations, either wholly or in part. And my ego stays out of it if they don't want to accept recommendations wholly, because I understand the School Act makes that completely appropriate. So I think that's important to recognize. So, punchline, the case manager should include at the IEP meeting, and this is starting to front load you for tomorrow morning as we jump into the nitty-gritty, a manageable number of realistic and achievable long-term goals, those LTGs, social skills, communication skills, self-determination, and academics. Those are the 4 umbrellas. Under those 4 umbrellas, you're going to have short-term objectives, which are SMART objectives. These are the things, the specific, observable, measurable things that the student will be taught and learn as a result of effective special education services. The tactics for achieving those, right? The special and special education is the tactics. That has to be in the IEP, and means to assess those. So those last 4 bullets are basically the 4-hour blocks that we're going to go through tomorrow. And the structure for tomorrow is that I will describe some of the big considerations and then engage in some application exercises where I'll share with you some examples of what not to do and some examples of how to make corrections and improve each one of those things so that you can go forward with a little bit of some tangible practice on how to think about the wording of short-term objectives and tactics and all of those elements.